hyper-aged Korea. And I'm particularly pleased to welcome our new colleague as moderator, Ellen Kim, and an old colleague and friend who I work with at the Council on Foreign Relations, Darcie Draudt. So this is going to be a great panel, and I'm really looking forward to having both of them on stage for this discussion. Darcie's been working on Korea's aging society for a while. This is a slow-moving issue for journalists, but it is already almost here before we know it. And even in the title here, there's a new word that I learned is actually a categorization for an aging society, hyper-aged. And so we'll learn, I think, a little bit about that. Also, I just want to point out that Darcie has written last year for us a post entitled From 6 Children Per Woman to 0.7, How South Korea Confronts Its Population Cliff and Shrinking Labor Force. And also, we have another post by a non-resident fellow, Terrence Matsuo, called South Korean Conscription and the Challenges of a Declining Population. And I mentioned both of those because they were among our top 5 postings from last year. So this is an issue that I think increasingly we're getting questions every time we go out nationally about. It's a really important issue, and it is a steady earner in terms of attention and importance. So with that, over to you, Ellen, for our discussion.
Sure. Thanks, Scott, for the kind introduction. Good morning to everyone in the room and those who are joining us online. My name is Ellen Kim. I'm the new academic director here at Korea Economic Institute of America. Today is my first time to moderate a public event since joining KEI last week, and it's a great pleasure to be joined by my close colleague, Dr. Darcie Draudt-Véjares, to discuss our upcoming paper on Korea's demographic trends and challenges. As Scott said, this is one of the most pressing issues facing South Korea as the country has become one of the fast-growing aging society in the world. And the resulting decline in the labor force poses a serious question and demands a strong government response to ensure the country's economic productivity and prosperity, but also to ensure the country's longer-term national viability. Darcie's paper will be published in the Korea Policy Journal, which will be out in June and will be made available on the KEI website. So I strongly encourage everyone to read it. When it's a great paper with a very interesting argument and data. And for the housekeeping purposes, we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So please save your questions. And for those who are joining us online, you can submit the question through our website. Without further ado, let me properly introduce our speaker. Dr. Darcie Draudt-Véjares is a fellow for Korean Study at the Carnegie Institute for International Peace. She also holds a non-resident fellowship here at KEI, George Washington University Institute for Korean Studies, and the National Bureau of Asian Research. She holds a PhD in political science from Johns Hopkins University, MA in Korean Studies from Yonsei, and also AB with the honors in anthropology from Davidson College. Welcome, Dr. Darcie Draudt-Véjares. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Ellen. I'm delighted that this is your first panel that you're moderating, and thanks, Scott, for the kind introduction. As Scott mentioned, this is an issue I've been following for a long time, and nowadays in the media, there's a lot of, I think, quite sensationalist, but in the same sense, very real warnings that Korea's birth rate is quickly becoming the lowest in the world, along with Japan, and what that forebodes for the Korea. So the most sensationalist headlines are saying things like Korea is headed for extinction, which I think is a long time off, and it's pretty premature to make those sorts of claims. But at the same time, the changing population structure, that is, how many Koreans are over the age of 65, this hyper-aged category, versus working age, 20s through 65, and then younger, that's very much changing in a way that's quite unprecedented in world history. Korea is not alone. Japan has really been following a similar trend, but the difference is Korea is happening at a much faster rate than Japan is, and then both of those countries are happening at a much, much faster rate than what's happening in Europe, especially Southern Europe. We'll talk about a little bit the comparative implications, which I think is a really important part of how we understand Korea as well. But what I wanted to do is set up how I'm thinking about this issue. This is something I've been thinking about for over a decade now. And I've studied this question of aging Korea and the falling birth rate in particular for a variety of ways. In fact, that issue of falling birth rate is where most of the government questions have been following. It's how do we get Koreans to have more babies? So this has been happening through a lot of pronatalist policies, things like childcare subsidies, tax incentives for larger families, even a marriage, even matchmaking kinds of initiatives, and targeted immigration policies. And this has been happening, even though the international media has caught attention to this maybe in the past 5 years, these policy changes have been happening for over 20 years. But they haven't been effective. In fact, the birth rate has going down. So what I wanted to do in this paper, and I'm doing in my research in general, I'm continuing to work on this, is explain, one, why does demographic change matter when we think about Korea? And in this case, I study political economy, so I'm defining it in economic terms. And then why does it matter how we're problematizing it? Why what policies we're talking about maybe not be effective, and maybe we need to think about this issue differently, especially if this is a global trend. So I'm going to set up a little bit what it looks like in Korea. This is a growth of Korea's population over time. It's a steady upward trajectory from the 1960s, the period where Korea had its liftoff, its high industrialization period through today. And so Korea benefited from what's called the demographic dividend. In the post-war era, there was a big baby boom, meaning by the 70s and 80s, there was a large workforce to support the industrialization period. But what's happened over the past 20 years, you can see since the 2000s, is a slow, gradual evening out of that curve. In fact, it's so much so evening out that a couple years ago, Korea's population actually decreased for the first time. It was a slight decrease, but still, that caught a lot of people's attention. This is I pulled this from the Korean government website, or the Korean statistics website, so apologies, it's in Korean. But this is what's showing the population structure. And that's kind of the target of what I'm looking at today, is why structure matters. It's not just that birth rates are going down, it's not just that maybe the total population is decreasing, but where along the age cohorts, where do Koreans lie? So what this graph shows, to explain this is called a population pyramid. On the left, it's 1960, middle is today, and then the next one is the future, 2072. What it shows is on the left, it's the men's total population, and on the right, the blue, is the women's total population. So you can see the gender balance is actually quite even in Korea. But what's distinct is that you can see in the first graph, it's pretty heavy, right? There's a lot, this is the baby boom, the effect of the baby boom, a lot of younger Koreans. Today, and we're skipping quite a lot, 65 years, but today it's much more rounder in the middle, but importantly, it's getting older. Do you see how it's kind of heavier starting to get on the top? And then the projections is pretty even more stark, right? It's very, very aged. So you can see the little bubble that's in the middle of the graph, its average age is 63. That's pretty incredible. Average age of Koreans by 2072 is projected to be 63 years old. That's really close to retirement. I mean, technically the retirement age is 65 right now. There's talks of moving it up. But that means that most Koreans are going to be many Koreans are disproportionately going to be older. So these dramatic shifts, like I said, they're foreboding an extinction. But what I wanted to say is that in this paper, and what I'm trying to do in my research, is that rather than asking the question that we've been asking ourselves, we meaning scholars, demographers, the policy community in Korea and further afield, international organizations have been really interested in Korea's case as well because of the speed. Instead of saying, well, how do we get Koreans to have more babies? I wanted to ask, how can we change Korea's economic systems in order to thrive under this reality of demographic change? Because the fact is Korea, the policy levers aimed at increasing the birth rates haven't been working, but two, this is a global trend. So this is something in the case where other countries can very much learn from what Korea is doing because the workforces around the world are getting older. So the framing, like I said, is part of a broader research agenda, and I'm particularly interested in not just the government, but how the private sector, especially Korean startups that play a key role in this, I think, are rethinking this challenge. So that's research that I'm going to be doing this upcoming year that I'm really excited about. But all in all, I think that this is underpinning what I'm conceptualizing now as a two-track framework that I develop in the paper. The first part of it is technology-driven productivity. How do we maintain output? Well, with fewer and older workers. The second one is structural economic reforms, realigning capital, labor, and finance for this reality of a hyper-aged society. So the key point in both of these pillars is that they depend on a robust workforce development and policy frameworks. So rethinking what does it mean to be a worker. And then this includes reskilling programs, phased retirement incentives, caregiver visas, which I'll talk about at the end, and pension reforms. So I want to first explore how these trends are reshaping workforce dynamics and sectoral pressures. So before I do that, though, I'm going to define what does it mean to be hyper-aged. So hyper-aged is what happens in a society with declining fertility rates, and it raises the median age, like I showed before in that earlier graph of the 3 population pyramids. What that means then is that its longer lifespans are swelling that age, that upper age cohort, 65 plus. So in Korea, we're projected to pass the national threshold for a hyper-aged society pretty soon here, which is defined as 20% of the population are over the age of 65. And Korea is actually projected to hit that this year in the national total. But the result then, from a workforce, from an economic perspective, is there's fewer workers and more dependents. So dependents meaning both those that are school-aged, but those that are retired. They depend on the workforce for the national economy. And then secondarily, and this is very important, especially for a hyper-aged society, is that it's going to stretch healthcare costs and pension budgets, which is right now, for those that follow Korean news, is a pretty hot topic right now, pension reform. So the takeaway here that I want to leave you with is that demographic aging means fewer hands and more mouths, put crudely. But this is the challenge that we have to solve. It's not just simply increasing birth rates. The other thing that I want to, I alluded to this before, is that what Korea already benefited from is what demographers called the demographic dividend. So the temporary surge when working age people outnumbered the dependents. That means that the workforce is much more productive than those that are depending on them. So Korea already experienced this. Most industrial societies experience this in their industrialization period. But once seniors reach that the proportion of seniors reach that 20% threshold, the demographic dividend flips into a demographic drag. So the care costs are surging, tax base erodes, labor shortages push firms to, and this is what's important here, to automate or to offshore. Right? And so now you see that it's a much bigger question that's facing a national economy. The next thing I want to point out is that this isn't affecting industries evenly. Right? So what I did in the paper is I dug into some of the Korean scholarly research on the sectoral trends for what employment growth looks like versus the share of elderly workers. This data is projections for this decade period between 2010 and 2019, so it's surveying that decade. So you can see that in areas where there's most growth at the top, health and social work, again, this is directly related to the hyper-aged society, 50% employment growth rate. That's really, really high. But the proportion of elderly workers is less than 10. Science and technology, another growth field in South Korea, and deservedly so, rightfully so. This is where a lot of our thinking for a post-industrial society in Korea needs to be thinking. 20% growth rate, but 6% people over 65. Then you can see that the ones that are at the bottom, that are heavily dominated by elderly, those 65 plus, it's a big category to say elderly, are those that are actually require a lot of labor, heavy labor. So agriculture and fisheries, 2/3 of the workers are over the age of 65, but that's seen a shrinking. So there's a mismatch here between the trends of where Korea's workforce, aging, hyper-aged workforce is going, and where is the growth by sector for its workforce. I'm not going to show that one yet. I don't want to. It's a confusing slide. So again, to underscore here, again, from an economic perspective, the workforce is going to be facing mass exits in precisely the areas where there's not enough workers. Okay, so then the next thing that I want to show, and I traced this in the paper as well, is that there's a regional and gender dimension to where these changes are happening. So by 2020, I'll explain this item. By 2020, 16 rural regions were already super aged. That means over 21% seniors, included Jeollanam-do and Chungcheongnam-do. So those were already hyper-aged. So this is happening. Busan already crossed that threshold in 2023. So that's another area where the municipal government is actually taking some steps to catch up with that reality. By next year, by 2026, Seoul and Incheon are expected to pass that threshold. So this is a very close reality right now. And then all regions are projected to reach that threshold by 2029. So here's this figure I pulled from a very nice scholarly article. It's a little bit messy, I understand, but what I want you to take away from it is all of these population pyramids, which we talked about the national one earlier, they're talking about different regions and cities across Korea. You can see the general trends from toward the upper age cohorts. So this is something that's affecting different parts of the country at slightly different rates, but it's definitely pronounced across the country. The other thing that I want you to take away from this slide is the map and the shading figure. So this is the total senior population change from 2020 to 2050. So the dark red means over 1 million people will be added to that hyper-aged portion. So you can see places like Seoul, Busan are already in that, they have a disproportionate amount of elderly. So this is something that you need to think about in regional terms, because the solutions for a city, a megalopolis like Seoul is, or a big city like Busan and Incheon, you're going to have to tailor the programs quite differently for their workforce and the industries that they have. Again, thinking back sorry, I forget the reverse one. In this slide, right? These industries are represented differently across the country. So it's going to require both sectoral and regional variations in how the workforce development is unrolled. The other thing that I don't have a slide for, but I get into the paper, is that there's a gender divergence among this older cohort in labor participation. So for women aged 50 to 64, so those that will be part of this hyper-aged cohort in the near future, there was actually a sharp rise in labor participation since the mid-2010s. So older women in Korea are actually joining the workforce in higher rates than men. And what's really remarkable is the data suggests that this is unaffected by the COVID-19 effects. So that's something interesting to think about, that women are still joining the workforce, and what sectors are they joining, right? Retail, real estate, administration, that's rising in the older age cohort for women. But for men in the same cohort, it's been stagnant or declining, especially in these labor-intensive industries like manufacturing, construction, and transport, where they're disproportionately represented. So the takeaway here is that aging is reshaping who is working just as much as where. So we have the regional variation, the gender variation. So the policies, especially considering that they're working in different sectors, must address the divergent needs of men and women. Okay, so this is where the trends are. This is where we stand. What I want to do with the remaining part of my time, and there's a lot I know that I've left on the table, is talk about the kinds of economic adaptation and policy solutions that I discussed in the paper. So I talk about, I think, 6 in the paper. I'm going to talk about 3 right here. The first one that I'm most excited about, and I'm starting to do I'm going to do some field research in Korea next month about, is accelerating technology-driven productivity. So Korea has a track record in its innovation prowess, right? It's at the cutting edge in a lot of important industries for Korea's national economy, but for the world, things like healthcare, biotech, automation, AI in manufacturing, and IA, intelligent augmentation of work, right? So not just AI, but IA. And all of these sorts of, this power, this technological capability of Korean industry can be harnessed to supercharge productivity. But the implementation, and this is the problems, is that it hinges on overcoming the adoption barriers among older workers. And then it also has some costs of retrofitting existing facilities. So the idea here is to support, but not replace, the existing labor. So this is a slightly different conversation than I think a lot of the general conversations that the media or we have in Washington about what is the threat of automation, what is the threat of generative AI. Instead, it's thinking about it as how can technology be used to assist the routine tasks and then free up the creative capacity of experienced workers that are in this older age bracket. So automating assembly and quality control to reduce the physical strain, but older workers retain oversight capabilities, and they have a lot, decades of experience in order to help with that. Using generative AI for data entry and analysis in desk jobs, but train people to provide intelligent prompts to enhance human judgment rather than replace it. And then finally, focusing on human and machine collaboration rather than full automation. So it's not just AI, but again, that intelligent augmentation that I mentioned. I have a colleague at Carnegie, the Fellow for Japan Study. We're working on some comparative research in this. Kenji Kushida, he has talked about this in terms of turning blue-collar jobs white. And that involves some intensive reskilling. So that's one of the major implementation challenges that we have. Also, it's the cost, the time and the financial costs of retrofitting shop floors and upgrading equipment. But this is something that Korea has already made steps into, just for it's maybe not necessarily with the aging workforce in mind. But one example that I'll give is in 2018, Korea started this Smart Factory program, which was targeting 5,000 SMEs, small and medium enterprises, to adopt sensors, robotics, IoT, Internet of Things, IoT devices, and analytics. And this is really important, and I talk about this in the paper because SMEs have been, they drive a lot of the change that's happening in Korea's economy. We think about Taebol, we think about Hyundai, Samsung, LG, but SMEs are a huge part of the domestic economy in South Korea, but they have historically been adopting these tech overhauls in much lower rates, and it's because of the cost, the time costs. So the idea of this Smart Factory program was to grapple with the slower tech adoption rates and overcome that barrier of capital investment. So this is something that can be benchmarked and built out with the workforce problem in mind. The success, therefore, depends on ensuring that the private sector and workforces have an affordable, user-friendly technologies to help upgrade SMEs and other corporations in South Korea. The second policy intervention that I want to talk about, and I talk about in the paper, is structural workforce reforms. That's a big heavy topic. But one thing that I'm also, as a political scientist, I'm really interested in this question of what's the relationship between the national people and the state? And this question's a bigger question, academic questions about citizenship, and this idea of, again, in academic terms, the social contract. What does the people owe and deserve, the rights and duties of the citizen and the state mutually, right? So in this case, we have this idea, and this is prevalent around the world. This is a global conversation that we're having. By no means this is specific to Korea. But this rapid demographic aging is intensifying this imbalance between what citizen workers owe and deserve from the government and what do retirees owe and deserve from the government in return. So this is, really important because, the idea of deserving pensions post-retirement, deserving public health care, thinking about what is the national labor market, who are you as a worker? These are very big philosophical questions, but at the same time, very practical questions as well. And so to address this, we need some integrated reforms to think about what does it mean to be a worker. So I think one, that tech augmentation that I talked about before is a really important part of this because it's helping making daily work easier and the work week easier, right? So that we should reframe, obviously I'm a tech optimist in this sense, right? Helping people use technology for their daily lives. What this means in terms of the structural workforce reforms this is a conversation that's pretty a heated debate in Korea, but phased retirement incentives. So it's encouraging senior workers to extend their careers in certain roles that are tailored to evolving capabilities. So this is a much more macro conversation, thinking about what does an older workforce do, and maintaining their productivity as they become, they require assistance in some aspects of the job, like those heavy labor-intensive fields, but maintaining their experience, and also, most importantly, mentoring younger colleagues. The next one, again, this is pretty political right now in South Korea, is the pension realignment that links benefit levels to this extended workforce participation. And this would ensure the pension system remains financially stable while providing adequate retirement security. And then third, and this is again where the tech element comes in, lifelong reskilling partnerships. So this is not just, this can't be, and I've talked to a lot of people in government and industry over the past year about this. This isn't something that can happen from the government alone. Industry needs to play institutes. So it's equipping older workers with new skills for these emerging sectors and roles in the sectors where they're already active. And the reason this is important for Korea, and Korea has a strong comparative advantage, is because the state, private sector, and educational kind of triumvirate, if you will, has a strong track record, a strong legacy of working closely together to set national macroeconomic goals. So that's certainly, characteristic of its high developmental period, but there's a lot of literature and academic literature that shows how those legacies are maintained to this day. So I'm happy to talk a little bit more about what that, I talk about that in my book project that I'm working on, but that core relationship between government, industry, and institutes, education and research institutes, is a really important thing that needs to keep going, and other countries can learn from the Korean case as well. Then the third one that I'll talk about briefly, and then I'll open I'll wrap up, is that, I've done a lot of research on Korea's immigration policy and how it's been an important factor in Korea's labor and demographic questions. But there's further targeting that Korea can do in the migrations sector. And I think the most important one is a stopgap measure with caregiver visa programs. So that's nursing and home care. This is something that's been debated in South Korea. There's a lot of interest groups that are proponents of it and those that are against it. But the idea is to recruit trained foreign professionals to strengthen the care infrastructure. So that's both healthcare and home care. And this buys time to upskill domestic workers into high-value roles while maintaining select immigration regime for those targeted home care and healthcare workers. So the idea here is that targeted migration policy can complement technology and the structural reforms that I was talking about, ensuring that nobody is going to fall through the healthcare gaps in the meantime. So I want to wrap up with, and I know we're going to talk about this, there's a lot of questions about this, but though the speed and scale of Korea's demographic shifts are certainly without precedent, with the exception of perhaps Japan, they're certainly at the vanguard of a challenge that every advanced economy is going to be facing. So this is a figure that I pulled from the New York Times. They had a really great piece with a bunch of these really great infographics, interactives on their website. But it shows that this upward trajectory of hyper-aged societies is happening across the world. And you can see on the right, the orange is Asia, and the blue teal is Europe. So that's where these trends are most pronounced. Remarkably, those are the post-industrial societies. And so I think that that's something that's really quite important to think about, that it is directly related to the political economy of the country. The other thing that I want to show, this is a figure, again, from the New York Times interactive page. It shows, in comparison, Korea, Japan, Italy, and Spain, the share of the highest portion of the population age 65 or older by 2050. So that's 25 years from now. It's not that far off in the future. So the top line in all of these, the teal line, is the number of working-aged citizens. The yellow line is the elderly, or 65 plus, and then the young, who are true dependents, are the blue at the bottom. So you can see that the proportion in Korea is quite stark, right? The proportion is going toward the elderly. But in Italy and Spain and Europe, this is it's pretty similar as well. So this is something where Korea is ahead of the curve, but countries around the world are going in this direction too. So in fact, every place except sub-Saharan Africa is becoming aged. So this is truly a global phenomenon. So I'll wrap up there. Thanks, Ellen. I look forward to all your questions.
Thank you, Darcie. This is really excellent research. There are many things to unpack, but one thing that really struck me most is the remarkably fast rate at which Korea's population is aging. And you mentioned in the paper that it took about 175 years for France to become the super-aged society. In comparison, Korea to achieve that hyper society status in less than only 25 years, Japan 36 years. So my first question is then what made countries like Korea and Japan become a fast aging society at a much faster rate? And relatedly, one of the slides shows that the world top 15 aging societies are mostly concentrated in Asia and Europe. And my question for that is that why that is the case? Is there a particular reason for that? Has there been any research on that question?
No, that's a really good question. And the research falls into a couple schools of thought. The one that I'm most interested in as someone who studies political economy is how an economic system and the rate of development interacts with these demographic shifts. So I tend to think that this is a really good explanatory factor for understanding the transitions both in Asia and in Europe in comparative perspective, but also that question of rate. Because for those of you who study Korea, when I explain Korean politics, Korean social trends, Korean economic trends, I think the biggest, an important thing to keep in mind with Korea is just how compressed a lot of these changes happened. Less than a century. So Korea went from a war-torn country in the 1950s, rapid development in a span of 2 decades, to one of the top global economies today, 12th in the world, right? And that happened within just the span of a couple generations. And how that interacts with the demographic trends is actually, a lot of the research shows, is there's a direct correlation to that. So that demographic dividend that I mentioned before, the post-war era, people there's a plethora of jobs now in Korea's developmental state model, and the state is guaranteeing employment for a large portion of the population. So that Korea experienced the benefits of that demographic dividend. But then the transition in the post-industrial period, there's a natural slowdown, and this is something that happens across countries. That's not necessarily exclusive to Korea. But what happened in Korea is it just happened in such a shorter period of time. And so the nature of the domestic economy changed, shifted from heavy manufacturing export, those jobs went overseas, Korea offshored, switched into a lot more knowledge economy industries, service industries, and at the same time, things like, and this is something that I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions on, social factors like increasing education costs, increasing real estate costs, kind of had a depressive effect on the birth rate as well. So that happened in just a much quicker period in Korea, in Japan, in Hong Kong, which is another country that's on here, Taiwan, the Asian tigers, the high industrialized countries, the rapidly industrialized countries in Northeast Asia, that happened at a much higher rate. So I think that's an important explanatory variable. I will say that some academics talk about a social or a cultural factor, but I think that on some, because this is something that's happening in other countries, that it seems to be much more interactive with the economic leg of this.
I want to talk about your argument. You argue that South Korea needs a fundamental policy shift, particularly that Korea's economic structure needs to adapt to the demographic trends rather than government trying to slow down the trends or reversing it. I think that argument is new and quite very interesting. So, but I would like to know more about South Korea's past efforts to tackle its demographic challenges and why has government policy been ineffective?
Yes, I've spent a lot of time looking at the policies that the government has tried to implement. And there's no shortage of policies. I've talked to a lot of policymakers and politicians and civil society, advocates in South Korea about the various aspects of these policies and why they haven't quite been effective. So one has been helping with childcare, and I'm defining that broadly. So things like childcare, public childcare services, at the neighborhood level, tax incentives. So like what we had in the United States during the COVID period when there was a tax credit for children. Long family leave policies. So actually recently, a couple years ago, South Korea implemented the longest, not just maternity, but paternity leave in the world, which is really, I think, quite surprising to a lot of people who assume that there's a strong bent toward focusing on the woman. But South Korean policy has actually tried to expand that. So right now, there's each parent can qualify for up to 18 months leave. There's a couple conditions for that. Both parents need to take it in order to be, not at the same time, but sequential. They need to take part of their leave in order to qualify for it. So there's no shortage of these policies. It's really well studied. Korean technocracy is working as it should. The problem has been implementation. The paternity leave policy in particular hasn't really been, people haven't taken it up. So I do think that there is a social dimension to this. There is, and I've talked to people who have been eligible for it, but there is a workforce stigma still attached to men taking leave. I think that might be changing soon, especially as corporations have been changing their workday policies, cutting down on after hours. Some companies even shutting off lights to discourage overwork. So I think that shift toward a more family conscious work environment is already going somewhere, and I've noticed this in the past 10 years of going to South Korea. So that it is an implementation problem. My argument, I should say, is it's not necessarily to completely give up these policies. I think that, especially given the trajectory, we can't, we still need to, the Korean governments and companies still need to support working families. That definitely needs to be part of this equation, especially as now we're getting into not just, we've moved away from the multi-generational household. So grandparents can no longer be the caregivers if they're working. We can't give up on that part of that part of the equation. But rather, we also need to think about this increasingly growing portion of the Korean society that, whether we like it or not, that's a part of Korean society, right? That's a part of Korean potential workers that isn't going away, right? So it's kind of like we're thinking about children that aren't yet there, maybe instead of thinking about current retirees that already are. So I think that we need to just think about the conversation a bit more holistically.
So talking about your economic adaptation strategies, what do you see the potential barriers or resistance or likely opposition to that? And what are the necessary prerequisites or requisites to make your argument successful also?
Yeah, I think there's a few here. Some are industry specific, some are social. I think the industry specific ones are, like I talked about before, ensuring, helping the innovations that are going to be assisting this workforce transition to this new era of automation, AI, IA. How is that affecting shop floors? How is that affecting offices? So that's a matter of enabling the private sector to do what it does best, and that's innovate. I think also from what I've been studying more about the role of startups in Korean private sector ecosystem, and that's, I think, an understudied and underutilized aspect of how we think about Korean industry. There's a recent book that came out called Startup Capitalism by Ramon Pacheco-Bardo and a co-author. He's, a friend of KEI. And he compares how the startup ecosystem works in Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and China, very different cases. And it's a nice first step in understanding why startups are an important part, and how they, especially in the Korean case, more so than in Japan, and certainly more so than in Taiwan and China, the startups are integrated with the chaebol in a way that's not necessarily competitors, but they actually link up for this innovation capacity. So I think enabling that ecosystem to do what it does best is an important part of it. The other one is, as I mentioned before, reskilling and thinking about reskilling in a way that's sensitive to the populations that we're targeting. I mean, you can't just tell people to do a job, right? It's enabling to do the job better. And this is something that I haven't done research on, but I'm doing this year. I'm going to go and do some field research and some more desk research on this year. I'm writing a Carnegie paper on it, so I hope to have a better answer for you then. But that question of uptake, of adoption rates among elderly workers or 65 plus workers, that's a key part of this, because I think about tech differently than my parents do, and certainly than Gen Z who grow up with it, and Gen Alpha that were born with a iPad in their hand. So thinking about how that matters across generations is really, I think, an important part of this. And then the third component is the financial cost of this. So that's where the government needs to be involved, because I think that there needs to be a strong subsidizing or financial incentives to make this shift happen.
One quick comment onto one of your comments is that elderly tend to be more than anticipated. They are much good at adapting to technology.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah.
I was surprised that my mom is so good at KakaoTalk text messaging. I actually learned from her some of the key functions. So
I do want to say, actually, this is a part of my motivation
Yeah.
for thinking about it this way. My mom was a retired school teacher.
Yeah.
She's a total tech-phile, and she's starting to get hard of hearing now. And so at our Thanksgiving dinner table, she used tech to help transcribe in real time conversations.
So don't
It kind of
underestimate the senior workers.
But it's a very specific use of technology that I wouldn't think of, right? Too. So I think there's actually a much more holistic, problem-driven, right? Thinking about how different populations find problems and how technology can solve this, rather than just supplanting this techno scheme on top of everyone.
Yeah. I want to have some questions, a Q&A session. So just last question. Korea sees Japan as a good example to benchmark. I guess there's a lot of lessons for Korea to learn from Japan's experience, but I would like to ask you specifically, what are the things that Korea can apply from Japan's experience, and what are the things that may not necessarily apply to Korea's case? Are there things like that?
Yeah. Based on my research so far, I think Japan is a bit further along in the adoption of robotics in daily life. Certainly that's something that I think we see a lot in the media, but that's something that, and I know that there is a Korea-Japan kind of startup ecosystem going on, where those sorts of learned ideas about how robotics can help, not just in production, but also in daily life, can be part of the conversation. The other thing, and this is how the policy-making systems differ in Korea versus Japan. I'm like a wonky political scientist that loves policy-making systems and policy processes. But in Japan, the municipal governments have a much stronger role in policy, and they're much more responsive to the local society. And so I think that's, whereas in South Korea, there's a difference of scale, I think, here as well. But Seoul or Sejong as the administrative capital really drive a lot of policy. So I think that regional variation approach in Japan might be something that Korea can learn from. But at the same time, I think it can go both ways. Certainly, again, in that startup ecosystem, Korean companies have a lot to share with Japanese. And the rate at which Korea is adapting to this, certainly it's pronatalist policies, it's public policies aimed to help families. That's very advanced in South Korea as well. So there is a lot of learning going on. There's a lot of back and forth. And perhaps leapfrogging in different aspects of this complex and tricky issue area.
Sounds good. So we have a few minutes left. I'd like to take some questions from floor. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. The mic is going around. And please identify yourself before you ask question to the speaker.
Right, thank you. We have an online question. We have an online question from our non-resident fellow, Terrence Matsuo, and he asks, does the focus on increasing employment by older Koreans take off the need to develop Korea's welfare net, and how does this dynamic play out politically?
Thanks, Terrence, for the question. I'm glad you're calling in. No, in fact, I think if anything, it actually supplements it. And it thinks about these questions in a more holistic way. And this is getting into the financing of it. and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but in fact, Korea can't support its continued welfare policy without engaging an older workforce. As productive members, productivity, how do we define that? But as workers in society who are paying into the tax system and not drawing down from the pension system, it's actually quite integral to supporting it in aggregate. Then the other thing, and this is kind of the purview of the Ministry of Health and Welfare in Korea, is it's pulling on all aspects of its responsibilities. So in that sense, I think it's actually expanding the conversation rather than it's a net positive rather than a zero-sum game.
There's a question at the back.
Stanley Kober. In order to deal with this problem, you have to move people out of the public sector into the private sector. They have to be net tax revenue generators as opposed to net consumers. However, because of the international political situation, we are all increasing defense spending, which means more people, and these would be the younger people who have to be producing the revenue, will be going into the armed forces. So this is another complication, and I'm not sure how you deal with this given current tensions.
Let me take, are there any questions? So let me collect some questions, and then Darcie, you can address it all at once.
Thank you. I'm Joshua Park, South Korean Navy retired captain and affiliate at George Mason University. I'm very glad to see you, Dr. Darcie Draudt. We had a joint webinar at Jamestown Foundation 2022.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I have two questions. One is specific, another one is broad question. First question is there any specific reason that for this, when you explain the female and male seniors get a job position that male has less proportion, less number who involved that job rather than female, that you suggest the reason that male, they could not follow the modern technology like AI or any other computerized skill, then it makes sense. Then do you have any other cause or variable that to explain the male's less, involvement of job? Then second question, which is broad, that do you have, could you present a couple of Korean demographic change qualities comparing to other society? You know, demographic change is very, globalized situation, very not unique in South Korea. If you have compared to some of Asian countries or United States, then I'm happy to you propose a few of qualities of South Korea's demographic change. Thank you.
You mean the characteristics of it or the drivers of it?
Characteristics. Okay, a sort of uniqueness. Thank you.
Great. I'll go ahead and take all of these. Stanley, thank you for your point. And it's a really important conversation that's been going on in Korea for a long time, is this question of, well, there's two aspects to your point, I think. The first one is quite directly is the number of soldiers in South Korea is going down. So actually, again, I've been studying this for a long time, almost 12 years now. And the people that were actually in the foreign policy community here in Washington, so the ones that were first, hip to this were the military officials, the people from the Ministry of National Defense or officers themselves, because they saw on the ground that they were looking down the barrel of a declining troop. Number of troops in South Korea because of the declining growth rate. So that this has become a big political issue in Korea as well, whether to expand to women, to counteract that certainly. That was a factor, I think, in part of the 2022 presidential election that came up. So that's really much at the forefront of the minds of Koreans. So that's one aspect of it that is, I think, mostly closer related to this question of A, birth rates, and B, whether women should be included in the service. But I also think that there's another conversation that's happening. My colleague at Carnegie, Tongmin Lee, is doing research on how does tech affect the future of warfare in Korea? How does that interact with the defense industries in Korea? And so I think that that's actually where a lot of that conversation is going, is not just a traditional troop maintenance, conventional force in South Korea, but also how does the next generation of warfighting technologies, of defense technologies come into this? So that's again where that aspect actually connects with industrial development, technology, innovation, is thinking past the number of Koreans who are part of the military, and instead is how would a contingency look like? What are they trying to defend against, right? These are big geopolitical questions that requires a much more wonky conversation and how that's affecting it. But that's, I think, in some respects, a very similar way to think that the military part of this question is very similar to what I'm suggesting with the civilian workforce or the private sector workforce. And I take your point about moving from the public to the private sector. It's no coincidence also that this is happening as Korea's economy has also, again, the scale being the past 20, 30 years, Korean export-driven economy has also offshored a lot of the jobs that the heavy, in manufacturing, they've offshored a lot of those jobs too, the private sector jobs are going. So that's another pressure, that geoeconomic, the global political economic pressure that's affecting the macro economy of South Korea as well. As far as for the question for Joshua Park, thank you for your question. It's nice to see you again here. One thing I want to say is I didn't mean to insinuate that there was any technological uptake difference between men and women age 65 up. There might be, I haven't done that research yet, but my point was more that this only shows the aggregate numbers of so-called elderly workers. But this analysis, this report that I drew this from, also did a by gender breakdown. And the important thing here is that the industries that are, one, more labor intensive, agriculture, fisheries, are more male. Two, those are also industries that have also been driven overseas. So that's another effect that's driving men out of the workforce. So it's not necessarily that they are not looking for employment, but those jobs aren't necessarily there. Meanwhile, the sectors where there's been the biggest growth, real estate, retail, it took a hit during COVID. Those tend to be much more female workforce participation. So it's less a question about tech uptake that's driving that trend that I mentioned, and more what are the sectoral differences and the trends for employment growth and how that's affecting the gender differently. And so that's, again, I think speaks to the fact that there are different economic solutions, like workforce support solutions to this, and then also tech, right? The technology that we're talking about, as we're talking about automation, is much more, I think, helpful for older Koreans who want to stay in their manufacturing or agricultural jobs, right? Changing agriculture. I've seen a lot of really. It'd be fun to include it in a future presentation, but agriculture isn't necessarily digging anymore, right? It's driving a tractor, and so then driving a tractor goes to pushing a button. So its idea is like moving the technology away from the heavy work that I think is going to be that there's not really a gender dimension to that. It's more of the sector specific jobs. And then the question about Korea's the qualities, the different characteristics. That's a tricky one. I think that, one, as I mentioned earlier, I think the rate of change in South Korea, economic change, the transition from agricultural to industrialized to post-industrial society is just so much faster than in Europe, to get back to Ellen's earlier question. So that's a big factor in this. The other one, I think there is, I shied away from it before, but as Ellen mentioned, my undergraduate degree was in anthropology, so I'm always very sensitive to understanding what's the cultural factor in this. I don't think culture can fully explain all of these trends, but if you look at how family has changed in South Korea, again, this is based on a lot of sociological research and historical research that I've read, there is, I think, a dimension to the educational attainment, the strong pressures for over-education, like to always be in hagwon, right, for children. That's expensive. That is shown to have a depressive effect, right? Like people don't want to have kids if they have to pay for hagwon, 5 hagwon for 2 kids. That's really expensive. So I think that's a particular culture, but there's similarities. I think in other like China has a big cram school culture as well. The increasing costs of housing in South Korea, I think, is a big part of that as well. So that's I think, the United States, we're also having a bit of a housing crisis. So there's a little bit of similarities there, but the scale is, and the variations are different. The regional variations in the US are different. Korea is smaller than the United States, so it's just happening at a much more concentrated rate. So that's another factor. I think I'll leave it at that, yeah.
There's one last question I'll take from the audience, online audience.
Thank you. We have a question from Hannah Foreman. She says, thank you so much for organizing this great event. And the question is, what role does immigration play in covering the age gaps in the South Korean workforce?
Thank you, Hannah, for the question. It's nice Hannah's my institutional neighbor at Brookings. We share, so it's nice to hear you. That is a really good and important question, and one that I've spent a lot of time. Actually, I presented on migrant policies as part of the same KEI series, maybe 6 or 7 years ago at this point. So yeah. So that's online at KEI. It's in multiple ways. So I actually, my dissertation was on immigration in Korea, and something that I found in the Korean case is when we understand Korea actually, people say Korea has no immigration, and that's a bit myopic. Korea actually has had a quite refined immigration program for the past 20, 30 years. It's just been extremely targeted. So the biggest group of foreigners in South Korea are migrant workers, guest workers. There are foreigners who typically are in the 3D, difficult, dirty, dangerous jobs, manufacturing, agriculture, fisheries. A lot of them are in the rural areas, so maybe not necessarily seen every day if you just go to Seoul. They're coming from China, Southeast Asia, Bangladesh, Cambodia, and they're doing, the difference is, and this is why it's really an economic logic to this program, is they're limited to 5 years, and they can extend it another 5 years. And it's responsive, the numbers are signed on a per country agreement, responsive to the workforce demands of the year. So the idea is like, this is a guest worker program that's smart and responsive and adaptive to whatever the workforce demands are in the year. And the other thing that I will say about this is a lot of these foreigners are employed as subcontractors for big companies, so you don't necessarily, in a sense, they're kind of invisible to how we understand the export heavy industries in South Korea, because they're subcontractors, but they're working alongside Koreans in shipbuilding, in agriculture, as I mentioned, in heavy industries. The other politically significant portion that as it pertains to demographic decline are what in Korea are called marriage migrants. Which has been a program in South Korea that started as kind of a bottom-up phenomenon. It's what in the West we call mail-order brides derisively, but in Korea is kind of built on a tradition of matchmaking, and Korean, mostly men. The phenomenon is very male-heavy in the sense that 90% of these marriage migrants are women coming from Southeast Asia. I could talk forever about this, but the logic of this program is to help men who can't find wives in rural areas, especially, find wives in foreign countries who want to come to Korea and live the Korean dream and start families. And so the program became benchmarked a Korean healthy family program. There's Korean, they call them multicultural families, damunwa 가족, and there's centers all across the country to help with education, health, welfare, job finding for these foreign spouses. And so again, all of this is framed to explicitly counteract the declining birth rate. So that's, I think we could talk about Korean women not having babies, and a lot of the programs have targeted that. But this marriage migrant phenomenon and policy was actually a really big part of how the Korean government thought about it, and it's literally changing the culture and the ethnic background of Koreans. About 1 in 10 marriages every year are between a foreigner and a Korean person. So I think that speaks to the scale that this is actually something that's really important to the Korean society and Korean politics going forward.
Well, you're right on time. It's 11:59, so thank you for that. But we should follow up with the more conversation as there will be lunch prepared. So with that, I would like to really wrap up today's event and thank Darcie for her excellent research, sharing her insights. So please join me in thanking her for her time and insights. And just one housekeeping matter, please, we will come back with another Korea Policy event in June, so please stay tuned. Thank you.